In this last mini lecture, we're going to talk about the remaining types of geophytes and how to propagate them. So last time we ended with tubers. Now we're going to talk about tuberous roots. Now tuberous roots are thickened underground structures for food storage that are modified roots. So they look very similar, but a tuber is a modified stem. A tuberous root is a modified root. And so what you see in the picture here are sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are tuberous roots. Regular potatoes are tubers. So here are some more examples of tuberous roots. Your dahlia is a tuberous root. Sweet potatoes are tuberous roots. And cassava is a tuberous root. Now cassava you may see sold at the grocery store by other names. Sometimes they call it a yucca root, which is really deceptive because it's not the root of the traditional yucca plant. But yucca root, cassava, same thing, it's a tuberous root. Now, because tuberous roots are roots and not stems, they do not have stem parts. That means they don't have nodes. And so you can't just cut it up into pieces like you would a regular potato. For starters, potatoes, when you cut them up, and many tubers are this way, they, on the cut surface, form sort of a chemical boundary to prevent rotting of that tuber piece. It's called suberizing. So tubers suberize, tuberous roots don't. So if you cut the tuberous root into pieces, it'll end up rotting. The other problem is, since it doesn't have nodes, it's not going to produce adventitious shoots and roots because there's no node or bud for it to do that, not from individual pieces. Now, the tuberous root as a whole, not cut up, but as a whole, will produce adventitious roots and shoots, as you see in the picture here. So there's two ways that you can propagate a tuberous root, other than seed and tissue culture, which again, we can do for all geophytes, but we don't do it for most. I will say dahlias are an exception. Dahlias can be propagated by seed. You can sow dahlia seed and you will get flowers within the growing season, and they will stay fairly uniform as far as appearance. But that's just a special situation with dahlias. With other tuberous roots and other geophytes, if you grow them from seed, again, you won't get it to a marketable size very quickly. It'll take several years for it to bloom or form a large tuberous root, and you'll have very genetically different offspring. So dahlias are kind of freaks. They're different with the seed propagation thing. All tuberous roots you can propagate by crown division. So this is the regular division that we talked about at the very beginning of this set of mini lectures. So here you would find the crown of the plant. The tuberous root is going to be deep underground on sort of an extra stem, but above the ground you have shoots of the tuberous root plant, and you have regular roots in addition to the tuberous roots. So you can simply use crown division to divide that plant and have a new tuberous root plant. Again, this is pretty easy to do with dahlias, and I'll show you a picture about why later. A lot of tuberous roots, again, if they're intact, not cut up in pieces like a tuber, will also produce adventitious shoots and adventitious roots, and those adventitious shoots are called slips. And often you can cut the slip off and stick it straight in the ground and it'll root right away without rooting hormone or anything else. So that's a popular way to propagate tuberous roots, particularly sweet potatoes. So here you can see sweet potatoes producing slips. And you'll notice that for the most part, these slips are all produced at one end of those sweet potatoes. That's because, again, this is a root tissue, so it'll produce, like a root cutting, it will produce shoots at the proximal end, roots at the distal end. But if you cut it up into pieces like a tuber, it just won't work. Now what's really interesting is these slips will either root right there, still attached to the tuberous root, or if you cut them off just as they are and plant them in the ground, they will root right away and you'll have a new plant. So that's how they commercially propagate sweet potatoes. Now this is sort of a fuzzy picture, but this is crown division of dahlias. So here with the dahlia, the tuberous roots are all clustered together right there at the crown, and you can cut each of them off as long as you maintain a portion of the crown, plant them out, and have a bunch of new plants. So that's how you propagate tuberous roots. Again, crown division or slips. Our next geophyte is the rhizome. It is a modified stem structure in which the main axis of the plant grows horizontally at or just below the ground surface. The plant pictured here is an iris. Most irises have rhizomes. There are a few irises that are true bulbs, but a lot of them are rhizomes, and you can see it, this thickened portion at the base of the plant. Here are a lot more examples of plant species that have rhizomes: bamboo, sugarcane, banana, grasses, some irises, lily of the valley, lowbush blueberry, and ferns. So here, that thick modified stem is very obvious, and it's quite a bit longer than you would imagine a tuber or a corm or a tuberous root being, so it's different in appearance than all of those. And again, it is just stem tissue. So how to propagate a rhizome? Very similar to how you would propagate our other stem tissue geophytes like corms and tubers. You basically just cut it into pieces containing at least one bud, or at least a couple nodes. Sometimes that'll work even if you don't have a bud. You may hear, in regard to rhizomes, the term pip. A pip is just a section of the rhizome with roots and a terminal flower bud. So you can cut off a pip and grow a new plant from that as well, but it doesn't have to be a terminal flower bud. It could be a subterminal flower bud, or it could be a leaf or vegetative bud. As long as there's a bud on your rhizome section, you should get a new plant from it. But I do want you to be familiar with that term in case you come across it. And here again, this is an iris rhizome. You can see they have a couple pips separated off, and then a couple of rhizome sections that they certainly contain a few nodes. It's hard to tell from this picture whether they have any vegetative buds, but hopefully they do. If you have a bud, you have a much higher chance of success of getting a new plant. And then our final type of geophyte is the pseudobulb. Now, pseudobulbs are different because they're always above ground. Every other type of geophyte we've talked about is different from a pseudobulb in that it's underground, or at least at ground level like the rhizome. But pseudobulbs are always above ground. They look sort of like bulbs, which is how they get their name, but they're actually a specialized storage structure produced by many orchid species, so they're only in orchids, consisting of an enlarged fleshy section of the stem made up of one or several nodes. So it is, again, modified stem tissue. It is only formed in orchids. Now you guys are going to have a special segment just on orchid propagation coming up next week, so we'll discuss it in a lot more detail then. But propagation of orchids can be done by offshoots that form on the plant, or division of the pseudobulbs, or propagation through special types of pseudobulbs called backbulbs and green bulbs. But in the case of backbulbs and green bulbs, it is again somewhat of a division type process where you're cutting off one or maybe a few pseudobulbs. So I'm not going to go into detail on that, just to give you sort of a teaser for next week. And with that, we have finished our discussion of the propagation of geophytes.